And our last speaker is Dr. Jennifer Barton. She is a professor of biomedical engineering and interim director of Bio5 Institute at the University of Arizona. Her research focuses on the development of miniature multimodality optical endoscopes for early detection of cancer, including instrumentation design, preclinical experiments, and translation to human pilot clinical studies. Is this the right presentation? Okay. And Jennifer just last year had a project that was supported through the Center for Future Technologies in Cancer Care, and she may describe a little bit about that, but we're looking forward to her experience in developing the clinician-engineer relationship.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much for sticking here and for coming to listen to this. I'm going to talk a little bit different type of presentation and talk about experiences that I as an engineer have had working with physicians and clinicians. And I hope that all our experiences are as good as the picture I have up here on the slide right now. This shows our gynecological oncologist there in the center, who has in his right hand a device that we built, which is one of our first laparoscopes that we built for imaging the ovary. The lady on the right hand side is a MD PhD student who got her PhD in my lab and was allowed to scrub in and actually participate in the surgery. And the gentleman on the left hand side is an optical sciences student who was back there operating the instrument, and we were all crowded into the operating room together, and it was a really great experience of how we worked together very carefully. So I came across this and loved it and wanted to show it to you all. I think you'll get the reference to Aesop's fables and the crow in the picture. And so at first this might look like a dig at doctors, right? The doctor is there putting one pebble in at a time, trying to raise the water up in order to drink, and the engineer very cleverly just says, get a straw. But I thought there's probably another story that could go along with this, and so I made up a story based on some experience which I won't admit that I have ever had, but maybe some people I know. So a crow has fainted, goes in to see the doctor, and the doctor says, you're dehydrated, so you need to go get some water. And the crow says, well, the pitcher I normally drink out of, just the water level has gotten too low. And the doctor says, well, for thousands of years, we figured out this way of solving that problem. You put one pebble at a time into the pitcher until you can drink the water out of it. And so the crow goes off and it proceeds to put one pebble at a time. An engineer walks by. She looks at the crow and says, what the heck are you doing? This is some antiquated, horrible way putting you through having to lift all those pebbles into the pitcher. I've got something better for you. Here's a straw. Puts the straw into the pitcher. The crow is excited. People flock around. They look at the straw. They go, this is the most marvelous thing ever. There's a great deal of excitement. There's venture capitalists who get involved. And pretty soon there's a new medical device company called The Straw. And that works out really well until a couple of months into this, a few things become apparent. There's some distribution problems here. The straw can get to crows in urban environments, but they're having a hard time distributing it to all the crows in the national forests. And there's another problem in that some of the straws that they've distributed are not going to being used for drinking and rehydration. They're being going to use to build nests and are getting fouled and are unsuitable for drinking anymore. And then finally, the engineer gets very upset and goes, how come you doctors are not prescribing the straw to all your crow patients? And they said, has nobody ever told you that crows don't have any money? So that's several points in which engineers can sometimes fail, so this could also be a little bit of a dig at engineers as well. I think there's truth in both. There are some healthcare providers that get stuck in ways and do not think about novel ways of doing it. Engineers indeed are very, very clever, but if they don't think through the whole process beyond just the technical cleverness, things can go really wrong. So I went around and I talked with a bunch of people because I knew my experience. I came from an electrical engineering background, went to a school which at the time did not have a medical school associated with it. So I actually, had a pretty siloed education, even though I do have a biomedical engineering PhD. And so I knew the experience I had had, but I wanted to hear what other people had had. And I thought, well, we're going to hear a lot about you need to have your meetings at 7 o'clock in the morning when engineers typically don't like to get up, but clinicians are available. Or the clinicians need to respect engineers and realize that they're not just technicians that are going to, twiddle and build what you want. We need to work together. And I did hear some of that. But really the themes that came through are some of the things that have already been talked about this afternoon. But I'll just reiterate them. These 5 things came up over and over again in the people that I talked to. And the first is understand the market. And by this is the clinical need. And this is really interesting because no engineer working for Johnson & Johnson would ever come out with a new type of toilet paper without doing a market assessment. So why do, somehow or another, there's this idea that something is fundamentally different in the business world and the way the world operates just because it's a medical device or a drug or a diagnostic. And so absolutely understanding how large the need is, what kind of impact you could make, what's the competition, what are the barriers to acceptance are really important. And this is really important to avoid building unwanted and unneeded products. It's normally engineers that are guilty of this, but I would say that this is on both sides. Understanding the regulatory process, which can have a great deal of effect, a simple change. We were talking about screening procedures here. If you have something as a first-line home test, it may have lower barriers to entry and be less expensive than something that is truly a diagnostic. Tailoring the device, and I'll speak mostly about devices here because that's what I'm interested in, but this holds for any sort of medical product. Tailoring the device complexity to the risk and prevalence of the disease. And one term I heard a couple people mention was an equipoise point, where the cost is balanced with need. And that, of course, may depend on the location. It may depend on exactly what it is that you're doing, but thinking about that ahead of time. And then thinking, of course, beyond tertiary care centers, and that's for people like me who don't have the experience of working in other countries and in places where you don't have all the resources available in a big city. This is something that doesn't necessarily come naturally, but thinking about distributing, operating, and maintained, heard about not having the ancillary products to go along with the devices, those types of things. How can it be maintained in a developing environment? And will the cost both for purchase and maintenance be appropriate? And finally, one of the things that I think mitigates this a little bit, engineers love to do the latest and greatest, and oftentimes you don't necessarily know the answers to these questions, right? So it's not necessarily a bad thing to create a first generation device that has all the bells and whistles and gizmos and gadgets and measures 100 different items, as long as the eventual idea is to go from high tech to light tech, to figure out those things that get you 90% of the way there with only 1% of the complexity. All right, so I think what I heard over and over again is that if people continue and work these ways with these common goals in mind, that actually a whole lot of that perceived engineer clinician barrier actually goes away because you have a common vision in mind. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my example there in ovarian early cancer detection. So I did actually know enough to think about looking at what the actual need was there. It's a relatively uncommon disease, about 22,000 new cases per year in the United States, but it's highly fatal. So maybe 14,000 deaths per year in the US. It's rarely caught at the early stages because the symptoms are vague and unspecific and usually don't become apparent until the disease is advanced. One of the interesting things that's come up lately that has really changed the whole paradigm is the thought that ovarian cancer starts in the fallopian tubes, or at least many cases of high-grade serous carcinoma, the most deadly kind, may start in the fallopian tubes. It may exist there as an intraepithelial carcinoma for years before it spreads. And then once it spreads, it occurs very rapidly. So can we think about something taking a key from cervical cancer in a way, except we need to now sample the fallopian tubes, potentially. So that now means that rather than that surgical picture I showed you, which was from 10 years ago, where we were looking at doing laparoscopic imaging of the ovary, fallopian tube imaging could potentially be an office procedure. Not easy, but you can get into the fallopian tubes without doing any sort of tissue cutting. It is a technical challenge because the fallopian tubes are about 1 millimeter in diameter at their smallest point. And then, so device operator training would be a challenge to be able to build a small endoscope and get it into the fallopian tubes. And then thinking about who's the appropriate patient population, and this was a really interesting question too, because who is that? Who would go through a procedure like this? Who would it be appropriate for? If you're thinking just in the United States, we can think of the increasing cases of availability of BRCA genetic testing. And so more and more women are finding out that they do have BRCA mutations. Because those put a woman at such high risk for ovarian cancer, oftentimes they're counseled to simply undergo oophorectomy. And so those might be people who would be interested in going for a visualization of their fallopian tubes rather than going straight to an oophorectomy. If you expand that to women who are at high risk due to family history or, family or personal history of breast cancer, it could get into the millions. So I said, okay, all right, this sounds like something worth doing. So I went to a couple of gynecological oncologists and said, okay, tell me, if you were to build an ideal imaging ovarian cancer screening system, what would it look like? And this is what they said. Minimally invasive, non-destructive. High resolution, we'd like to be able to see the cell nucleus shape. Okay, but if you can't do that, tell us the suspicious areas through molecular imaging. Image 10 millimeters deep because just in case we want to be able to see all the way through the ovary. Image markers of proliferation, ideally P53 because that's what we do in histology. Easily packaged into a small sterilized handled probe, rapid image acquisition presentation, inexpensive, easy to use, compatible with biopsy. And I went, So, this is not all currently possible. Some of these requirements defy the law of physics for optical imaging. So I went back and I said, okay, here's what we can do. With the current technology, it is theoretically possible, at least, to give you most of what you're asking for. There's a couple things we can't do. We cannot image 10 millimeters deep, but I'll tell you, based on the current idea that ovarian cancer is a fallopian tube disease, it's actually, probably isn't as important of a requirement anymore. And we can't give you P53 mutations because that occurs in the cell nucleus, and any sort of in vivo agent that went into the nucleus would be a mutagen hazard, and of course that's not what you want to do here. But the rest of us, maybe we can take a whack at and see if we can do. So we went through it, and we started with the problem definition. We go and we build some endoscopes. We do some benchtop tests. We do some preclinical studies, or clinical studies. We get some data, and usually we find out that what we built doesn't really quite work as well as what we want. We get physician feedback, and we start over again. And we've done that a couple of cycles now. I think one of the things we've learned is you shouldn't wait until the very end to get feedback all the way through, because it could probably shorten that cycle quite a bit. And so going on to something now, I think this probably falls more into the high tech than the light tech. But we started by saying we probably need a highly miniaturized 0.8 millimeter diameter that will get us into the fallopian tubes endoscope. And we're going to do one channel of multispectral fluorescence imaging, and we're going to throw the book at it because we're not entirely sure which excitation wavelengths and what emission bands will be best. But this is a generalized system that can do that. We've got this beautiful 3-element lens system here that's 300 microns in diameter. That's the size of a grain of sand, just for reference. And we're going to have an illumination fiber here, and then we're also going to have, we're going to have an OCT as well. I should stop using the pad there. And we're going to put it all into a system and try it out and see how it works. And I put this up because I love optics, but to show you, we've really built a beautiful design. And I beat on my optical sciences students who wanted to build a 10-element lens system and said, no, make it as simple as possible. And we finally came up with this, and we were very proud that we had only 3 curvatures. Everything stacks, so you just push them together, and it actually has outstanding performance. So we found one company in the entire world that would build these lens systems for us. It cost us $8,000, and it took 18 months. All right, but we did get them eventually. then we put them together, and this is a picture on the left-hand side of assembly under a microscope. So I always joke that the students in my lab are hired for their dexterity and smallness of their fingers rather than anything else. But, we were able to come up with a technique where we were able to assemble all of this. This is, showing the sheath pulled back, and build a couple of prototypes of this scope. On the bottom right there, that's showing it against actually a tissue model that we had our surgical simulation facility build. So that was great. It looks like, from an endoscopic view, it looks like human tissue. It kind of feels like human tissue. It's about as slippery as human tissue, and so that was really helpful for our testing. We went through and we did some performance measures of it, and it is beautiful. It really is. I'm super proud. Considering this thing is only, 0.8 millimeters in diameter, you have exquisite imaging. This image here in the center, if I can do this without advancing the slide, this is what you can get when you combine fluorescence images at different wavelengths. That's a follicle in the center. Oh, that's a laser pointer. Awesome. Awesome. There we go. Okay. So there's the follicle in the center here, and the fallopian tube surrounding it. This is pig tissue. Some fat here. It all glows in different colors. We can differentiate things really well. We haven't done a whole study yet of looking at a large study of cancerous and non-cancerous tissue with this endoscope, but our previous experiments looking at tabletop versions of this said it's very good at telling the difference between at least frank normal and frank cancer. This is a picture of the OCT channel where we can clearly see the muscular layer and the inner part of the fallopian tubes and all the different folds that occur in there. So it's really a very nice endoscope, but it's probably not going to become commercialized. We are actually in talks with a medical device company that would like to license it, and they're really interested in figuring out how can we go light tech, right? That's great. You built the Rolls Royce. Now let's come up with the econo version of that. So we're looking at a bunch of things now, and that's been really very helpful. One of those is to use a GRIN lens, or a gradient index of refraction lens, instead of the custom 3-element lens. There are a couple of trade-offs you do in that. The imaging performance is not anywhere near as good. You can't use ultraviolet wavelengths. However, we've gotten a little bit of pushback anyway about putting ultraviolet light onto reproductive organs, so that probably is not going to be a major loss. The image that we have there shows that it does work, not quite as well. However, it's now something that's about 50 cents instead of $8,000. So that's a great thing. It's also a lot easier to build. Do we really need both multispectral fluorescence imaging and optical coherence tomography? I'm not sure if we're going to be able to answer that question until we've done a larger trial. But it certainly would be simpler if we could have just one of them. I didn't even mention, right, this thing is steerable. We have little nitinol wires that look like human hairs right now where you can steer it back and forth. And that I think is something that is going to depend on, if we're looking for a little small area of intraepithelial carcinoma in the fimbriae of the fallopian tubes, and they're big and floppy at the end, and we have this little 1 millimeter diameter endoscope going in, we do need to be able to steer it around. But we need to evaluate how sensitive our fluorescence imaging is to that. We may not actually need to get into every nook and cranny in order to detect it. And overall, we'd like to make it inexpensive enough to be disposable. And I put that in, and then I heard one of the previous speakers talking about making things more robust and reusable. So I'll reevaluate that. But for the U.S. market, it might be nice to make it disposable because that would be simpler. So looking at the cost, need, and the utilization, this is the thing that got me into this group here, which has really been helpful. Going into the fallopian tubes, there is a precedent for that. It's been used for fertility assessment, especially in the 1990s. There are surgical sterilization procedures, not just the coils that are put in, but radiofrequency ablation and other things like that have been done. So the challenge is, from talking to people who have done that procedure, is actually cannulating into the fallopian tube and avoiding perforation of the fallopian tube, which doesn't appear to be catastrophic, but it sounds to me like something you would definitely want to avoid. And so I was really fortunate to work with the CFT, CC, and the Fraunhofer Manufacturing Institute on a balloon deployment system that we were looking at to see. An averting balloon has been used previously. Is there some way we can do that to gently guide the falloposcope down the channel and avoiding perforations? And so we got to work with them, and I noticed the brochure you're handing out has a nice picture of the handles that we developed. And so we're hoping with that to expand the user base to OB-GYNs, and so that this is something that could be more widely used. So it's still a little bit more high-tech than I think something that would necessarily be appropriate globally, but this shows the process that we've been going through in order to try to create something that becomes less expensive, more widely usable, and again, it's a process. So I think, I would say in summary, the key to strengthening the engineer-clinician interface is to make sure you're working towards a common goal that you both agree upon. Communicate frequently, have some feedback frequently, and have respect for each other and have a lot of patience. This is a process. We've been working on it, and things will just continue to improve. So thank you very much.
I think one of the other things that Jennifer may not have noted, but at least in the beginning, finding a common language as well between the engineers and the clinicians also may help that process as well.
Yeah, absolutely. A common language is really helpful, and it's something I think that comes from interacting with each other. Yeah, and students can do that too. Having that MD, PhD student was probably the biggest help for me in overcoming that barrier.
Do we have any questions for our speaker? If you can just repeat the questions.
What is the time frame from when you define the parameters to, you build this thing, and then is that a typical time frame, or is there no typical because it totally depends on the product?
So I've been working on imaging of ovarian cancer for about 10 years. Okay, and when we first started, the thought was that it arose from inclusion cysts in the ovary. So we were trying to figure out how to get to the ovary, and thus the laparoscopic procedures. It's interesting. Things change, as medical knowledge increases and we learn new things, you have to become adaptive. This particular scope that we've been working on has not been particularly long. It's been about 3 years. If we do manage to license it to somebody who has resources with, more than a couple of engineers in actual manufacturing facilities, they might be able to get it into a larger scale trial pretty quickly. That's all relative, but, maybe we're talking 6 or 7 years. Yeah.
Pure the time from when you say, okay, we have these parameters that you said, we want all this, and then you threw the second slide over there with no, yes.
Yeah.
And then from that point on to the Cadillac that you built, is that about 3 years, you say?
Oh, so that was 10, that list, but see, that list evolves over time too, right? But then I'll tell you, we also are at the whims of the funding agencies too. So I originally got a DoD grant to build the original prototype for that falloposcope. Those are 2-year grants, so darn it, you better get a prototype done in 2 years. That's helpful. Yeah.
Have you thought about maybe 3D printing just to try and keep costs down? It looks like that handle would be a perfect thing for a 3D printer, but I don't know.
Yeah, actually, that handle is 3D printed. So yeah, and I think I see the printer there in the back. So yes, absolutely, that's something that could be done, and it's very nice, high quality print. It's lightweight, and some of the newer materials are sterilizable as well. Yeah.
All right. If there are no other questions, we thank everyone for their time, and we also thank the speakers.